They thought the houses loved them. When we dug up the city, we expected terror frozen in ash, twisted limbs, desperate faces, the usual violence of a volcanic death. But instead, we found people reaching for the walls, smiling softly, as if the collapsing rooms were comforting them. Children curled against stairs like they were being rocked to sleep. And the worst part? Their expressions were not shaped by fear at all, but by trust. A trust so deep, it survived the moment their world turned to fire. If you want to know what could twist an entire city into loving the very thing that killed them, keep watching. A night settled over the villas with an unsettling weight, and the walls exhaled a sound like a wounded animal, a throttled moan rising from within the plaster rather than from the rooms themselves. A servant carrying an oil lamp felt the vibration before he fully perceived it, a faint tremor that crawled up through the tiles and into his ankles, as though the entire floor shuddered in protest at some unseen burden. The flame inside his lamp quivered without the help of wind, bending sharply to one side, as if pushed by a breath too large and too close to belong to any living person. He lifted the lamp higher, watching the painted scenes on the wall expand in the most delicate, horrifying swell, the pigments blooming outward for the span of a blink before retreating again with a reluctant sigh. A metallic sweetness clung to the air, thick enough to taste even without opening the mouth fully, and it coated the servant's tongue in a faint, unnatural numbness. He stepped back instinctively, expecting to find a crack, a draft, an animal wedged somewhere behind the walls. Yet nothing stirred, and the corridor held its breath in a silence that seemed to press against his skull. The oil in the lamp hissed softly, as though reacting to something unseen, something heavier than heat. No one in the district grasped the quiet betrayal hidden beneath their foundations. The aqueduct pipes, those proud channels that for generations had brought life to their gardens and luxury to their baths, bled a steady, invisible stream of lead into every vessel they touched. The fountains that sparkled under sunlight like veins of liquid glass were in truth delivering a slow and careful ruin. Families drank from them daily, believing themselves to be refreshed, unaware that each swallow carried a weight that would eventually drag their minds into distortion. In the kitchens, as food simmered over glowing coals, the poison thickened. It fused with steam, clung to pots, soaked into bread, seeped into broths meant to nourish children and elders alike. With each meal, thoughts grew a little heavier, drifting slightly out of alignment. What was once a firm conviction would waver. What was once a clear memory would shift at the edges. People awoke with faint headaches they blamed on restless dreams. Yet those dreams themselves had been sharpened and twisted by the metal creeping into their blood. Slowly the boundary between sound and imagination thinned to something fragile, tremulous, and unreliable. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. A hand brushing against a curtain would feel as if brushed in return. The villas, magnificent in their design and rich with mosaic and marble, became quiet conspirators in this dissolving certainty. Their walls seemed to hum at dusk, not with menace, but with a weary and resentful awareness, as though the stone understood the truth before its inhabitants did. And so the night advanced, carrying within it the first tremors of a madness too subtle to name. The servant, still clutching the trembling lamp, backed away from the sighing wall, unsure whether he had witnessed something real or whether his mind, softened by the poison he could neither see nor smell, had begun to fracture. Above him, the villa shifted once more, a nearly imperceptible pulse, like a living creature trying to wake. Days that once moved with the calm predictability of household rhythms began to warp so subtly that many failed to notice the change until it wrapped itself fully around their senses. Morning light, usually soft and golden, seemed to flicker as it passed through the latticework of pergolas, as though the sun hesitated before touching the courtyards. Gardeners trimming the laurel hedges found themselves pausing mid-cut, shears suspended in the warm air. A faint pressure would crawl across the back of their necks, light, cool, unmistakably deliberate. They would whirl around, expecting to catch a playful child or a wandering dog, yet the path behind them lay empty each time, lined only with fallen leaves that rustled without wind. The sensation lingered long after they resumed their work, as though invisible fingers had left a ghost of their touch behind. Within the villas, matrons resting in shaded atria pressed their hands to the mosaic floors when something in the stillness shifted. The stone beneath their palms seemed to sigh, releasing a low and mournful vibration that seeped up through their bones. At first they dismissed it as the echo of footsteps in another hallway, but the patterns grew too distinct, too sorrowful, too imbued with a kind of ancient fatigue. Reclining on their couches, they sometimes felt that the gods depicted in the intricate tiles had begun turning in their eternal slumber, stretching cracked limbs beneath layers of dust and time. It was a strange comfort at moments, an odd illusion of companionship, yet it was accompanied by a chill that had no place in the warm air of the atrium. Servants exchanged wary glances whenever their duties carried them across thresholds or down narrow corridors where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally. Candle flames leaned sharply to one side, even when the windows were shut, as though reacting to a slow, rhythmic pulse that had nothing to do with drafts. Amphorae placed neatly along shelves creaked faintly, a brittle sound that could easily have been blamed on settling clay, if not for the unsettling regularity of the noise, like a breath patiently drawn and released by something that required far more space than the storage rooms could offer. The wealthiest families began to whisper among themselves that their homes were turning restless. Some suspected the presence of spirits, perhaps offended ancestors or capricious household deities who demanded renewed offerings. Others feared that some unspoken sin had stirred a curse, though none could point to a specific transgression. Despite their unease, few dared to speak openly of what they felt. They were people of status, accustomed to control, reluctant to admit that their own rooms made their skin prickle with dread. Their physicians, summoned with increasing urgency, offered calm reassurances that did little to soothe the growing fear. The strange sensations, they insisted, arose from the relentless summer heat that wavered over the walls, altering the senses and exhausting the body. Too much sun, too little rest, insufficient hydration. These explanations flowed freely from trained mouths, accompanied by confident gestures and soothing smiles. Patients were advised to drink more water, to bathe often, to remain indoors during the brightest hours of the day. They listened, obeyed, and unknowingly deepened their exposure with every jug poured from the gleaming bronze taps. The pipes that carried the water, once celebrated as marvels of Roman engineering, had begun to betray them quietly, invisibly. Lead dissolved into the flow with each passing day, collecting in unseen layers within the body. Thought slowed, though no one recognized the drag at first. A brief lapse in memory here, a moment of unsteadiness there, little incidents that seemed trivial, easily blamed on weather or fatigue. Yet the poison worked patiently, clouding judgment, erasing the line between real and imagined with the gentlest of pressures. In the bustling markets, traders noticed their patrons staring too long at simple wares, faces blank, hands hovering just above baskets of figs or bolts of dyed cloth, as if waiting for the objects to speak. Roads that once felt familiar began to tilt strangely underfoot. Occasionally someone would stop mid-stride, convinced the stones had shifted. Others muttered that the air itself pulsed like a swollen vein, thickening around them in waves that made their vision ripple. Nothing was truly stable anymore. Even silence carried weight. Back within the villas, the distortion deepened. Marble columns developed faint vibrations at odd hours, barely perceptible, yet sufficient to rattle the nerves of those who leaned against them. Doorways seemed narrower, hallways unnaturally long, gardens strangely muted. Birds avoided the fountains entirely, circling above them with uncertain wings before retreating to safer perches. The flowering vines along trellises wilted prematurely, their leaves curling inward as though whispering secrets to themselves. Some household members found their reflections subtly altered, not grotesquely, not enough to inspire immediate terror, just slightly off. Faces appeared a shade paler, eyes a fraction too hollow, the angle of a jaw unfamiliar. Looking into polished bronze mirrors became a tentative act. Many began covering mirrors with embroidered cloths, claiming it was to protect the surface from dust, though deep down they feared the moment their reflections might shift more noticeably, or even address them with a whisper not formed by air. Meals lost their comfort as well. The first bites tasted normal enough, but as the poison accumulated, subtler changes occurred. A stew might carry a faint bitterness at the end of each mouthful. Bread had a chalky undertone. Wine left a peculiar heaviness on the tongue, as though it clung to the mouth long after being swallowed. Instead of raising alarm, these changes were dismissed as minor variations in harvests or preparation. People trusted their food, trusted their servants, trusted their ancient routines. Trust, however, became a fragile thing as minds grew increasingly uncertain. At dusk, as lanterns were lit one by one, the villas became echo chambers of half-heard murmurs. A soft tapping might travel along a wall, pausing at intervals that suggested intention rather than randomness. The sound of something sliding gently across stone would drift through a courtyard without any visible source. Water basins quivered, sending tiny rings across their surfaces, as though stirred by the exhale of an invisible presence crouching just beyond sight. And yet, despite growing unease, the inhabitants carried on with their lives because the alternative, the possibility that something was truly wrong, seemed far more frightening. Even animals began behaving strangely. Dogs that once slept peacefully near their masters' feet now paced restlessly, hackles raised, eyes locked on empty corners of rooms. Cats arched their backs at closed doors, hissing softly at spaces where no human scent lingered. Livestock in outer buildings grew skittish, stamping and shuddering whenever the sun dipped below the horizon, as though darkness carried a physical force that pressed against them. And still, the lead flowed, each drop building upon the last. With every pitcher filled, every bath drawn, every pot simmered, the dosage increased. It settled quietly into bones, into organs, into minds, altering perceptions with a predator's patience. People began to lose track of small routines. A gardener forgot the sequence of his tasks and trimmed the same hedge repeatedly. A matron misplaced cherished jewelry only to find it later in absurd locations, as though guided by a hand she could not remember controlling. A servant swore he heard someone humming beneath the floorboards, a low melody vibrating through stone. By the time these distortions knitted themselves into daily life, many had grown too dulled by the poison to question them. What should have sparked alarm instead elicited weary indifference or a vague sense of resignation. The villas breathed around them, restless and watchful, yet their inhabitants did not fully grasp that their own senses had already surrendered. Ordinary days were dissolving into something warped, and the city, unaware, unready, drifted ever closer to a catastrophe far greater than the murmuring walls that warned them in whispers they could no longer understand. Late season unfolded with a breathless heaviness, as though the city lay beneath a vast invisible bell jar that trapped heat, sound, and thought in a slow, fevered suspension. Evenings offered no relief. The air hung thick in the courtyards, refusing to cool despite the dimming of the sun. Nights stretched into long, viscous hours, each one blending into the next without a clear boundary. Residents who once fell asleep easily now lay awake on their couches, eyes tracking the wavering shapes on their walls. The painted scenes that had long adorned their chambers began to ripple gently, the figures shimmering as though submerged beneath uncertain water. A hint of motion stirred where none should exist. Draped cloth in a fresco might lift ever so slightly, as if caught by a phantom breeze, or the edge of a painted shoreline might crawl forward an inch before retreating again. Some began to notice their ancestors' portraits shifting under the moonlight. The once familiar faces softened at the edges, then sagged into unfamiliar grimaces. Lines deepened around the eyes, lips thinned or widened into grotesque imitations of smiles. It was never dramatic enough to shock outright, never violent enough to confirm with certainty. Instead, the changes hovered on the border of perception, small distortions that required only the slightest tilt of the head to reveal their wrongness. No one trusted their memories anymore. A portrait studied by lamplight seemed unchanged by morning, its composition perfectly intact, leaving the observer unsure whether the night had played a trick or whether dawn had quietly erased the truth. Walls themselves became complicit in the unrest. People lying in their beds felt the plaster inhaling and exhaling beneath their fingertips. A soft expansion pressed against their palms as though the villa breathed deeply in its sleep, and a slow contraction followed, accompanied by a faint groan within the structure. The rhythm was strangely regular, almost soothing in its predictability, yet profoundly disquieting. Homes felt alive in ways stone and mortar should never feel. The sensation of being watched crept through households with a persistence that could not be explained by heat alone. At times, a tremor traveled along a corridor, a vibration so faint it might have been mistaken for distant footsteps, though none approached. Outside, the city streets had begun to twist in subtle ways. A few residents, driven by rising dread or a sudden urge to escape the suffocating atmosphere, attempted to leave. They gathered small bundles, convinced that anything beyond the gates must be safer than the flickering madness within. Yet the moment they stepped onto the roads, the world tilted strangely beneath them. Stones shifted in delicate waves, as though the earth had been replaced by a living muscle that flexed inconsistently. The horizon blurred at the edges. The act of walking felt like wading through a dream where distances stretched and compressed without logic. One foot landed firmly while the other seemed to sink into something softer than earth, though nothing visibly changed beneath their sandals. Those who reached the city's perimeter felt an overwhelming weight descend upon them, a dense and nameless force that pressed against their chests and bent their resolve. Their vision swam. The world quivered. The gate towers loomed larger than they should, leaning inward as if attempting to seal the inhabitants inside. Even the sky over the fields beyond appeared unreal, tinged with a color that did not seem to belong to any season. The faint ringing in their ears grew into a low thrum that matched the pulse of the walls back home. Within moments, escape felt not only pointless but impossible. Most turned around without truly deciding to, compelled by an instinct they could not name. They returned to their villas in a haze, unable to remember precisely why they had abandoned their attempt. Sleep, when it finally came to anyone, arrived in fractured bursts. Dreams tore through the mind with a feverish clarity that bordered on prophecy. Some dreamed of rooms that expanded endlessly, their walls rippling like the surface of a pond struck by unseen hands. Others saw a great dark mouth opening beneath the city, inhaling everything, streets, people, breath, into a cavernous void. A few woke with the taste of metal thick on their tongues, convinced they had been chewing on coins or bitten by cold, unseen teeth. Sweat soaked their clothes even though their skin felt chilled. No dream lingered long enough to interpret. They dissolved upon waking, leaving only a residue of fear that vibrated through the ribs like a plucked string. Daylight brought no comfort. The fever of late season deepened as the poison, patient, persistent, invisible, continued its work. Thoughts drifted in slow circles. People found themselves standing still for long stretches, staring at corners of rooms as though waiting for someone to emerge from them. Simple tasks became complex labyrinths. A matron instructing servants on household duties suddenly forgot the names of familiar objects, pointing helplessly at bowls and fabrics as though they belonged to a foreign world. Gardeners caught themselves trimming the same branch repeatedly, carving it down to a bare nub without understanding what they were doing. The boundary between intention and action frayed. Sounds behaved strangely as well. A voice calling from across a courtyard arrived distorted, elongated or shortened unnaturally, as though carried by a shifting current of air that refused to move in straight lines. The scrape of sandals on stone echoed with unnerving delay. At times, a whisper traveled through a house without any clear source, slipping along walls like a trickle of wind despite the heavy, stagnant atmosphere. People began to avoid speaking aloud unless necessary, fearing that their own voices would return to them altered, carrying a resonance that did not belong. Hearts trembled with a fear that had no name, not because the residents understood the nature of their affliction, but because they sensed that something vast and unseen had begun to unfurl around them. Their minds unraveled in slow spirals, each loop carrying them further from solid ground. Even the bravest felt a deepening suspicion that reality had grown porous, that something waited just beyond the thin membrane of perception, pressing its form lightly against the edges of their world. And still, the city carried on, suspended in a feverish twilight, unaware that the madness quietly growing within its walls signaled a far greater calamity slowly gathering strength in the mountain looming above. At the dim edge of dawn, when night still clung to the roofs and courtyards like a departing spirit, the mountain finally groaned. It was not a sound anyone could reasonably mistake for wind or shifting frost, yet the city, already eroded by doubt, fever, and the slow unraveling of its collective mind, received the noise with unsettling indifference. A low rumble crept across the stones, vibrating through alleyways and archways, slipping beneath door frames like a cautious intruder. Dogs lifted their heads, but did not bark. The air itself held its breath, taut with the weight of something vast awakening. But most citizens, tangled in the remnants of their fractured dreams, barely reacted. They blinked at the quivering shadows on their walls and dismissed the tremor as yet another hallucination conjured by their corrupted blood. For weeks, the boundary between the real and the imagined had thinned until it was as fragile as the translucent skin of a lantern. People trusted neither their senses nor their memories. A door that had always opened inward seemed suddenly to resist, as though it had been built to swing the other way. A courtyard fountain ran with clear water in the morning, but shimmered with the faint odor of metal by dusk. Those who still clung to pockets of rationality found themselves exhausted, forced to decipher each new irregularity like a riddle designed to unmake them. In such an atmosphere, a groan from the mountain, ancient, resonant, impossible to ignore, was easier to deny than to accept. Admitting it meant acknowledging that the world outside their fever was changing too, and that terror was not confined to the chambers of their own minds. The rumble subsided, leaving a tingle. Their faces twitched with the faintest spark of recognition, as though a buried instinct had fluttered briefly and died. A few returned to their restless pacing, or their compulsive muttering, or the aimless rituals they had devised to steady themselves against the dissolving fabric of the world. The second tremor arrived with greater force, a deep heave that pushed up from the earth's core and rolled through the city like a slow, deliberate breath. Plaster cracked along a dozen villa walls, shedding pale dust that drifted through the air like morning mist. Roof tiles clicked against one another. The courtyards shuddered underfoot. Yet instead of panic, a strange tenderness settled. Their fingers traced the jagged new fractures with intimate familiarity. Another woman pressed both hands flat against the rippling mural in her dining hall, murmuring promises that she would not abandon the painted figures who now swayed like fevered dancers beneath her touch. They were too far gone to understand what the trembling meant. Their minds, softened by weeks of distorted perceptions, no longer recognized danger in anything that moved or breathed. The pulse of the earth felt to them like the pulse of their own walls, just another strange rhythm in a season filled with shifting realities. Had someone shouted of imminent disaster, of the mountain's agitation, of the ancient force stirring in violent impatience beneath its stone shell, the cry would have been dismissed as yet another echo of the communal fever. But not everyone was lost entirely. A small handful, battered though they were by sleepless nights and muttering illusions, felt the tremor with a clarity that cut through the labyrinth of their confusion. A teacher who had once lectured on the city's founding myths jolted awake, the hairs rising on the back of her neck. She recognized the sound buried within the rumble, the faint grinding of stone against stone, like the shifting of colossal plates. It echoed something she had heard only once before, many years ago, during an expedition near the mountain's lower slopes. Then, it had been a soft quiver, dismissed by her colleagues as normal movement of the earth. But she had not forgotten. She rose now, trembling with a fear deeper than any she had felt during the fevered dreams of recent weeks. Elsewhere, a young apprentice stonemason emerged into the courtyard of his master's villa with frightened eyes. The quiver that passed through the flagstones beneath his feet was no hallucination. It was a message, a warning, a shifting of foundations that should have lain dormant for centuries. Still, fear alone was not enough to rouse the city. The majority drifted on in their haze, swaying like reeds in an unseen current. When the third and strongest tremor struck, it did so with a violence meant to be unmistakable. The mountain exhaled a roaring sigh that swept across the valley. Birds scattered in frantic spirals. Water in the fountains leapt and spilled over the edges of their basins. Doors swung inward or outward at random as the earth jerked beneath them. Even the deluded, those who had begun speaking to walls as though to cherished friends, fell to their knees or grabbed at the nearest support, startled out of their rituals. But confusion still shielded them from comprehension. Some cried out in wonder rather than fear. A woman offered a trembling laugh, convinced she was dreaming. Another stumbled into the street and embraced a shaking pillar, praising it for its honesty. When an entire row of houses shivered in unison, a group of children clapped, imagining it to be some new game created for them by the living city. Those who retained remnants of clarity felt despair bloom in their chests. They saw the truth that others could not. The world itself was shifting. The mountain was not merely settling or cracking. It was waking, and beneath its ridges lay a force older than their city, older than the oldest chronicle. A presence that had slept through countless generations now stirred with violent impatience, as though roused too early from a dream of its own. Dawn struggled to brighten the sky, but the light arrived in a dull, coppery sheen. The horizon quivered. The air tasted of stone dust and brittle expectation. The trembling finally ceased, but the silence left behind was worse, a vast, echoing stillness that felt like the moment between lightning and thunder. The city did not yet understand that its days of fevered hallucination were ending, and something far more tangible, and far more merciless, was about to begin. The sky dimmed in a way that defied the familiar patterns of weather, as though the heavens themselves were being smothered by an immense, unseen hand. There was no wind to precede the shift, no gathering of clouds and layered grays, no scent of rain carried across the city. Instead, the light simply dulled, fading into a bruised half-glow that seemed to press down upon rooftops and courtyards with oppressive weight. Those who still possessed fragments of clarity felt an instinctive tightening in their chests, a dread that rushed through them like cold water. They looked upward and understood, though only dimly, that the darkening sky heralded something far stranger and far more lethal than any storm. But the rest, their minds softened by months of poisoned water and unraveling perception, greeted the dimness as a gentle shift in mood, an atmospheric whim sent to soothe them. Then the first ash drifted down. It arrived not as a violent cloud, but as tender flakes that fell in slow spirals, settling upon outstretched hands and upturned faces. It carried a faint warmth, almost comforting, and clung to skin like fine powder. The deluded welcomed it with cracked, joyful voices, murmuring that the long-awaited rain had finally come. Some laughed, believing the soft descent to be a sign that the world wished to caress them after so many restless, whispering nights. They gathered in the streets with childlike wonder, letting the ash settle in their hair and eyelashes, tracing its patterns on their forearms as though each speck carried a private message. Even as it thickened into a steady fall, they continued to stretch their arms skyward, swaying with dreamy contentment. Across the city, buildings shuddered in uneasy rhythm. The tremors that had begun at dawn returned with greater insistence, sending ripples through walls and columns, shaking mosaics loose from their settings. Yet many inhabitants clung to the trembling structures as though embracing familiar companions. When pillars vibrated beneath their touch, they interpreted the movement not as a warning but as reassurance. To them, the houses were living beings, faithful guardians who had whispered to them through countless fevered nights, and this shaking was nothing more than a comforting gesture, a shared breath, a reminder that they were not alone. Those still capable of recognizing danger tried to drag loved ones into the streets, pleading with them to flee, but their voices were drowned out by the soft sighs of those who pressed their cheeks against quivering plaster and thanked the walls for holding firm. The ash deepened, clogging gutters, widening rooftops, and transforming the air into a thick, swirling haze. Breathing grew more difficult with each moment, yet many inhaled deeply, convinced they were drawing in the scent of distant rain. Their lungs burned, but they interpreted the sensation as warmth spreading through their chests, a sign that the supposed storm wished to heal them. Even when visibility narrowed to mere paces and the world dissolved into shifting shadows, they wandered through courtyards with unsteady steps, humming tuneless melodies to themselves. The mountain's fury soon escalated beyond mere ash. A distant roar, muffled at first, then swelling into a thunderous bellow, rolled across the valley. The ground lurched beneath the city in heaving waves. Roof tiles clattered like panicked teeth. A gust of scorching air swept down the streets, carrying with it particles of burning stone that flickered red and orange like embers torn from a colossal fire. This should have shattered any lingering illusion. It should have driven even the most delirious to seek shelter or flee. But minds softened by toxin and terror rarely behave as reason demands. When the first molten stones arced across the darkened sky, many watched their descent with fascination. The glowing fragments, streaking downward like falling stars, seemed to them like gifts bestowed from the heavens. Some attempted to catch the smaller pieces, unaware of the searing heat until their skin blistered. Others retreated indoors not out of fear but out of devotion, as though returning to the embrace of beloved guardians. They pressed themselves against the swaying walls, whispering their gratitude for the imaginary lullabies humming from the floors and columns. The tremors beneath their feet, violent enough to crack marble and split wooden beams, were interpreted as gentle rocking, a comforting rhythm meant to soothe their frayed nerves. Inside these darkened villas, where frescoes rippled in the dim light and dust drifted through the air in ghostly sheets, the hallucinations reached their final crescendo. Walls seemed to breathe with deeper, slower pulses. Floors hummed with low, melodic vibrations. To those trapped within, every crack, every groan, every shifting shadow carried a message of affection. Some curled on the ground, believing the house was singing them to sleep. Others stood with arms outstretched, embracing empty air, swaying to the phantom lullabies that only they could hear. Outside, molten stones crashed into streets and courtyards, shattering fountains and igniting debris. The once gentle ash storm thickened into a choking darkness. The air grew impossible to breathe, but the deluded, lulled into false security by their own splintered minds, remained inside, mistaking disaster for tenderness and ruin for comfort. Even as ceilings sagged and timbers splintered, they whispered reassurances to their dissolving homes, convinced they were being protected rather than entombed. A few survived long enough to recognize the truth, but the realization came too late, swallowed by the roar of the mountain and the collapse of the world they had once known. The city, drenched in ash and flickering with falling fire, became a tomb shaped by misunderstanding. In the poisoned haze of their final hours, many believed they were cherished, even loved, never grasping that the whispers guiding them were nothing more than the last echoes of their unraveling minds. The silence that followed was not peace, but the final echo of a world collapsing inward on itself. When the mountain exhaled its last furious surge, a torrent of ash and blistering heat rolled across the doomed villas with the weight of an ancient verdict. Roofs buckled in an instant, beams snapped as though made of brittle twigs, and walls that had once pulsed with imagined breath caved under the force. Yet within these disintegrating chambers, the lead-poisoned bodies did not bear the expected contortions of terror or desperate flight. Instead, they froze in postures of devotion and trust, arms extended toward the very walls they believed had spoken to them. Some reached upward with open hands, fingers thinly spread as though welcoming a familiar presence. Others leaned against collapsing plaster, cheeks resting upon it with the serene expectation of comfort. Their stillness at the moment of burial had an almost ceremonial quiet, as if they had accepted an invitation rather than suffered a catastrophe. In one villa, a woman lay half kneeling, her face lifted toward a fresco that had long since melted into indistinct colors beneath the heat. Her expression, preserved in the fine grain of ash that encased her features, wore a faint, unsettling softness. The corners of her lips curved upward in a gesture that might have once been gratitude. Elsewhere, a family huddled together not in fear, but in a tranquil pose of collective assurance. The smallest child clutched a crumb of pottery, holding it not as a talisman of survival, but as an imagined gift from the murmuring house. The father's arms stretched protectively toward a crumbling archway, as though expecting it to steady itself and return his embrace. These poses froze not at the instant of panic, but at the end of a far longer descent, one in which their minds had bent toward the poison with such devotion that reality dissolved beneath its weight. Above them, the mountain roared, sending rivers of fire along its flanks and consuming everything that had once defined their lives. Yet within the buried chambers, the dead rested in eerie tranquility, captured in the final communion of a city that had long ago ceased to perceive danger. The ash hardened layer by layer, encasing bodies, broken beams, crushed mosaics, and shattered amphorae in a vault of silence. For years, then decades, then centuries, the city lay under this heavy shroud, its inhabitants caught between life and legend. The world beyond forgot the whispers of the poisoned walls, the confusion of collapsing days, the fevered rituals born from lead-sickened dreams. All that remained was the mountain's shadow and a faint memory of a place swallowed by fire. Then, many centuries later, long after the last descendant of the doomed city had vanished into the unrecorded folds of time, the earth was disturbed once more. Pickaxes struck hardened ash, brushes swept away fine layers of dust, and excavators, expecting the typical remnants of ancient domestic life, uncovered something far more unsettling. They entered rooms that had not felt a living breath since the mountain's eruption, their lanterns casting soft, wandering light upon shapes that seemed caught mid-gesture. They saw bodies leaning sideways against crumbling walls, their hands splayed as if reaching for reassurance. They saw faces that bore not the universal stamp of horror, but expressions twisted into a kind of dreadful affection. Some of the unearthed postures were so intimate that the excavators hesitated, unsure whether they had intruded upon a final act of trust or a tableau crafted by madness. One figure appeared to be comforting the wall, its arms tenderly circling a fractured column. Another lay curled at the base of a staircase, its head resting on a step as though soothed by some final whispered promise. Even the children's forms were strange, no frantic flight, no signs of struggle, only patient stillness, as if they had surrendered willingly to the collapse around them. The first archaeologists could not make sense of it. They saw no evidence of a panicked escape, no chaotic scattering of possessions, no defensive postures. Instead, they found houses filled with people who seemed to have waited calmly for their end. Only later, when traces of lead saturation were discovered in the household plumbing systems, did a fragment of the truth begin to emerge. Scholars argued and debated, piecing together the slow infiltration of poison into every cup, every ladle, every vessel that held water. They noted the accounts preserved in marginal records, complaints of voices in the night, of walls that seemed to breathe, of gods that stirred beneath mosaic floors. And gradually, a theory formed. The people of the doomed city had perished long before the mountain erupted. What the excavators saw in those frozen expressions was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of mental dissolution. By the time the first ash had fallen, the inhabitants had already slipped into a world sculpted by hallucination, a world in which danger disguised itself as comfort and destruction whispered in familiar tones. They had not died resisting the eruption, they had died trusting it. The final surge of the mountain had only preserved in ash what the poison had wrought in the mind. This realization became the greatest horror of all. The fire that devoured the city, the ash that smothered it, the collapse that sealed its fate. None of these were the true catastrophe. The disaster had unfolded quietly, invisibly, one small cup at a time, until thought itself liquefied. The mountain merely finished what the poisoned water had begun. And centuries later, when scholars looked into the gentle, trusting expressions preserved in ash, they understood that the city had not been destroyed in a single moment of violence. It had died slowly, softly, in the murmur of tainted stone, long before the first plume of fire pierced the sky.